Welcome to this week's edition of Business Insight. I'm glad you could join us tonight. Now, the recently released economy survey for 2017 highlights a positive indication for the Kenyan economy, indicating that the economy has grown up to 5.8%, up from 5.7% last year. Now, it's a survey that has sparked a lot of reactions, varied reactions from the public at large. In tonight's show, we unpack the drivers behind the drops and the growth of this economy of 2017. And in studio, I'm joined tonight by the Managing Director of Frankline Management Consultants Limited, Frankline, Andrew Frankline. Welcome to the studios.
Thank you for having me, Victoria.
Well, now, to begin with, the 2016 economy survey, what is your general view on this that is indicating actually 5.8% growth in the economy?
Well, I think the growth statistically may be there, as defined within the economic survey of 2017. It's an outstanding document that is packed with loads and loads of statistics, most of which, if not all, nearly all, I believe to be accurate.
Okay.
The real questions are which sectors are performing and which are not, which sectors should be performing, and why are they not? In other words, if you were to look at job growth, at real, genuine job growth and value creation, value chain creation, there's a lot of information here that basically says the country is not expanding. The economy is not, in fact, developing. In other words, there is statistical growth in the GDP, which measures the value of all goods, services, products that are put out. But that is also includes things that encompasses inflation as prices go up. In other words, we don't necessarily capture, by looking at some of what are called the headline issues, we don't capture the issues in the economy. And we don't look, this does not tell you about policies. This gives you data, which of course can be interpreted by politicians, critics, or anyone. But without looking at seeing what the figures, even the figures are saying, for example, if you look at 2011 in certain areas, 2012, and follow it all the way up to 2016.
So the 5.8% growth does not necessarily mean we are doing well.
It doesn't mean we have jobs. It doesn't mean that we are creating real jobs. And I think that is where we continue to go wrong, by focusing on GDP, by focusing on some of the raw numbers, including, for example, jobs in the informal sector, which are very hard to measure regardless of which country you're in. And also, these reports will come and go, and we won't interrogate, for example, were more PINs issued. If you have 600,000 or 700,000 jobs in the informal sector, that's wonderful if they're, but we're 600,000 or 700,000 personal identification numbers issued. We don't see a corresponding increase in bank accounts because we know for a fact that most people cannot afford bank accounts. Now, obviously, that has an impact on certain areas, which we like to talk about, which is M-Pesa. Mobile money grows as people cannot afford real banking.
We'll be getting to those specifics, but as per now, Franklin, we've seen the exports going down to 570.1 billion, up from 581 billion. That this is a decrease in exports. For a country to decrease in exports, is this a good indication?
Well, it's an indication that something is very wrong. When I went through the economic survey and made notes, I looked at certain sectors, but also certain countries. Have we increased our exports within the East African community? Do we have more imports from Uganda or elsewhere? If you look at from 2010, 2011 through 2016, some of the provisional returns, we do not. We are not increasing our business within this community, except for Burundi, where we export more because they make nothing. In other words, we're not actually able to build on previous years' accomplishments. We don't seem to be able to look and say, well, what did work in that sector? And why, for example, are we not making the most out of the East African community. And by not looking at these figures and then asking, well, what's going on? 20 years after the East African community was revived, we will not be looking at, for example, integrating the various countries' economies, the strengths and weaknesses of the different countries within this community. There are problems, legal problems, for example. There are taxation problems. We have no ability for no double taxation treaties with Uganda. So if you have a company there, a company here, you can get to pay taxes in both countries. These are the sorts of things that Uganda and Kenya have negotiated double taxation agreements with maybe Mauritius, with the UK, and other countries. So that if you open a subsidiary and you're British or Mauritian,
we see a decrease in imports. You know, we are seeing a decrease in exports, and also the imports here. There's a 9.2% decrease. What does this really mean?
If you look at an area like textiles, our imports have remained fairly steady in volumes and Kenya shilling values because it feeds into perhaps the AGOA facilities. If you look at textiles in another way, our imports of used clothing has gone up tremendously. Also, the government of Kenya has increased its revenue collection by taxing imports of used clothing. Notionally, we should be making all of our own clothing here, but we do not.
In other words, we're killing the textile industry.
In other words, well, we're certainly not developing any policies to make it grow. And this is very important because there is a very small section on AGOA, which indicates that essentially AGOA is only apparel, textiles. 17 years after the development of AGOA, which is a really tremendous program by the U.S. government, we have not developed the kind of value chain from cotton plantations, wherever they are, to button factories, to zippers, to threads, dyes. What we have are companies with people assembling products to be exported to the United States. But in 17 years, we have not developed more and more employment in parts of the country where it's desperate. Well, any employment is good employment, especially employment that is salaried, that's in the formal sector. And therefore, if we don't look at why we're not able to build on a good program, why we haven't made the most use of that program to benefit the people of Kenya, to take advantage of a really good break to export clothing duty-free, or 6,000 products duty-free into the United States market. That will not be around forever.
In your opinion, where's the loop? I mean, why are we not taking, or rather, why is the country not taking advantage of the AGOA program, which is a really good thing for the African countries?
In many ways, because of our energy sector, it's unreliable. There's also the fact that parts of the country were not very politically well connected where you would want to grow cotton. Western Kenya, Nyanza, there were traditional areas where cotton was grown. But if you're not extending your electricity grid, your energy grid, your roads, if in fact you don't have a financial system that lends itself to supporting, not SMEs necessarily, but supporting startup businesses in the agriculture sector. There is a reality in this country where commercial banks have stopped lending to the agriculture sector 20, 25 years ago. Remember, Victoria, I've been in this country since 1981. The economy has certainly changed in 35, 36 years. We used to have a highly centralized economy, import substitution. We made goods that may have not been world class, but they weren't too bad. We have in the last 25 years done some remarkable things, including liberalizing the economy. We did away with exchange controls. The reality is we cut corporate tax from 60% down to 30%. In other words, we took away a lot of the disincentives to come in here. On the other hand, when you look through the economic survey, and as I mentioned, you look and see, well, manufacturing has a problem because agriculture has a problem. Also, the energy sector has a problem.
Yeah.
That's backwards. Manufacturers will want cotton, for example, or they will want the agricultural products to process into finished goods if they're available and if there's a market for them. I looked at the line items, for example, for unroasted coffee. That remains fairly steady. In other words, we don't roast. We have a commodity that we do not add value to. This cannot go on forever. It has been going on for quite some time, and I think a lot of it is basically there's a lot of money floating around. But in reality, the formal economy, the formal sector is hampered by policy, and the policies are not so much being selected as being acquiesced in. And we don't find that the manufacturing sector demands reforms in the financial sector. So that instead of having 5 or 6 financial services regulators, which we may start consolidating into a financial services authority, so we actually can mobilize money, not merely from banks. But this is I see no real enthusiasm on the part of the private sector to demand the kind of changes that will in fact lead to growth.
Growth, and let's look at the regional growth economies in the region. We see Tanzania is at 7.1%. We see Rwanda is at 6%. Kenya is at 5.8%, and the average economy for the region is 6.1%. My interest is on Kenya and Rwanda. Rwanda, we just saw Rwanda coming up the other day, and it's already at 6%. Kenya is at 5.8%. What does it make you feel to see Rwanda growing at 6% and Kenya at 5.8%?
Well, I think Rwanda is a small economy, and it also came out of about 1 million dead people. It came out of it's building itself still out of an amazingly horrible situation. If you look at the United States and there's a growth of 2%, 2.5%, it's 360 million people. It's very hard to crank out big growth in developed economies. Kenya, in many ways, should be looked at as a developed economy. This is not some sort of frontier country. We became a frontier country after having been an emerging economy after the lifting of exchange controls. We have done a number of great things 25 years ago. The notion that somehow this is an economy that should be looked at in the same way as Rwanda really doesn't make a lot of sense. But that leads us into a lot of very harsh and critical sorts of thinking. What have we been doing wrong? And I think that's very important. We know, for example, that we're putting money into things like nuclear energy development secretariat. We have governments, friendly governments, falling over themselves to sell us nuclear energy. We don't have, however, the demand, even for the 5,000 megawatts, which is the target. We have a lot of trouble using up the 2,800 megawatts we have now, which is not even online all the time. These are facts. This is not about being harsh. These are facts that if you don't ask these questions, we pay a lot more money for electricity than other countries do, whether it's Egypt and others. Egypt has the Nile great. But we can always come up with explanations and excuses for why we're not like other countries. That is not, however, the answer.
Should the government be worried about this trend? Even though, like you said, the Rwanda economy is smaller than Kenya, but should Kenya be worried about seeing this kind of a trend?
Kenya needs to be worried that it is not capitalizing on the education of its population, that it is not creating salaried jobs, that countries like the United States, or Australia even, UK and others, South Africa, and I think Rwanda, are benefiting by having educated, skilled Kenyans living and working in those countries. People who go to the United States are not coming back here. Their children are born, they're U.S. citizens. There are so many legal and regulatory impediments to doing business here. Not even getting into the corruption angle. It is just difficult to make your way through a morass of regulations. And always saying it's going to get better. There's a lot of it can get better, and that's why the economic survey is full of data that makes a lot of sense and needs to be interrogated. This is not about we need more classes. We have to ask, why do educated people leave? If you were to look at our infrastructure, we don't really have a transportation infrastructure to facilitate exports. Of course, you could always then say, well, who would spend money developing an export-oriented infrastructure since we don't export finished coffee? We don't export as much garments. We don't, the numbers of footwear have dropped. And that's just in the last 4 or 5 years. In other words, if you were to look back at some of these surveys that I used to use in 1985 to 1993 when I did a Frost and Sullivan risk analysis for Kenya, you might be staggered to see how we have not developed.
Okay. Let's look at the jobs. You mentioned the issue of jobs, availability of jobs to the youth and to the citizens of the country. We see that according to the survey, we had about 832,000 jobs, new jobs that were created. But 75% of those jobs are the only ones in the formal sector. The rest, which is about 740-something thousand, is informal sector. Is this a good thing, rather?
No, it's not. It's a worrying trend, but it's a trend that was evident in 2007, where we did have 7% GDP growth without jobs. We didn't really have job creation. If we don't have a steadily growing manufacturing sector, we cannot create employment. And manufacturing, like it or not, is an engine of national growth. Countries, for example, like Mauritius, an island, small, great, when it went from sugar, a mono commodity economy, into textiles, they still export clothing, but not cheap clothing. And then they moved into finance and the like. India, I used to buy clothing. Well, I think a great example are the South Koreans, who will like to sell us nuclear energy and are helping Kenya develop nuclear energy. They use a lot of it. In the late 1960s, 1970, early 1970s, South Korea exported vast amounts of cheap clothing to the United States. It was affordable, it was well made, and it actually accommodated and met needs, genuine needs of people like me in college. They don't export clothing any longer. Now they want to export nuclear reactors. But South Korea also came out of a horrible war in the early 50s, dictatorships and the like, but developed the kinds of industries, manufacturing, that grew the jobs. And once you have people who are salaried, and you can then link up, for example, salaried workers with NHIF. If you look at the figures, they don't necessarily all match up. And I don't think it's, and I do, by the way, again, let me repeat, I believe most of these statistics are correct. Are accurate. There is nobody sitting at the Bureau of Statistics fiddling with the numbers and trying to massage numbers back to 2011, 2012, so you don't see what has happened in the last couple of years.
Let's now go down to the specific financial, the sectors, and we see the financial sector going down. We saw the agriculture sector, even though it's 32% of the GDP to the country, but this time around in 2016, the statistics show that it went down from 7.2% to 4.4%. If we see the agriculture sector going down at this rate, and we know this year it's an election year, and we saw the drought that we had, I mean, what's next for the country? Because if we saw 2017 going down to 4.4%, I mean 2016 4.4%, how about 2017? Is this a worrying trend?
Well, again, you know, if we are looking at agricultural production is mainly subsistence. Horticulture continues to do very well. Export-oriented. It's sort of the standout. But it's not just because people in Europe like flowers. They do, but that doesn't mean that it's recession resistant. We do not make the most use of our resources. The fact that there is a drought is no excuse how many people are still depending on rain-fed agriculture. We've had a national irrigation board since the early 70s, perhaps. They have a nice office on Lanana Road, but we don't have a lot of irrigation. If you were to look even at this, one of the stories about Dominion Farms in western Kenya or Nyanza, you know, that actually, the genesis for that irrigation and that whole draining of swamps was developed in 1951, 52 under the colonial government. It's just that it hasn't really moved very, very far. How many sugar companies do we have in this country that are limping along, looking for government handouts, and yet we don't demand to find out, well, why don't we even produce rum? Where are the other products from these sugar industries? If you have a company that is listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange and then delists to develop real estate rather than grow agricultural commodities, that tells you there's a problem with policy here. Not merely that the whole world has turned its back on a particular commodity. So I think these are worrying trends only because, well, we look and we see it. We don't know what the effect it has on the ground, the social dislocation, the effects on whether children go to school, whether education is ongoing. We're not seeing any of that. We don't ask these questions. Obviously, you know, we'd like to grow more food. Who wouldn't? In fact, this morning on the BBC, there is a series taking place about how there's more people in the world and we're not growing the amount of land. And yet, how much of our land here is dependent on rain-fed agriculture rather than the irrigation that we've been investing a lot of money in since before independence and have not, in fact, implemented.
We saw ICT being one of the well-doing sectors, and we saw a growth of 11.1%. And you earlier mentioned no country can grow economically on just ICT. Does this mean we are, or rather the country, the government is putting so much energy on the wrong sectors?
When you say putting so much energy, putting so much money, I think what are they putting is a lot of money going into ICT. Well, if it's government money, obviously there's a problem because that's tax money. And if you have people who are unable to grow food, well, obviously the priorities are all mixed up. On the other hand, we have had attempts here to develop call centers. I believe that's ICT.
Exactly.
I believe. And those call centers, which got lots of headlines 5, 6, 8 years ago, I don't know where they are any longer. Perhaps Ken Call is still around. But the fact is, that never took off. We are perfectly situated in the world for a 24/7 economy. I do remember that people were working at these call centers at 4 in the morning because you get telephone calls, you get calls from all around the world. What happened? That's ICT. I see that we have lots of apps being developed, I understand. But we never have any follow-up. We do not have the development of YouTube. In fact, that's not true only of Kenya. I mean, obviously, people can't do much better at times in places like South Africa either. They leave. But if we want to always talk about how this sector is doing so much better and that sector is doing so much better, well, let's see how that sector is doing next year or was doing last year, and how many of the startups, how many of the people who went to the Global Entrepreneurial Summit during the Obama visit are still in business. Are they? I can't tell you that. I don't know. And I couldn't find it in here, but then it's a huge document that I encourage people to look at, to get, because it has everything in it from how many voters there were last year.
And frankly, even as we finish this, 2 more issues for you to just quickly respond on. We had the World Bank recently just slashed the economic perspectives for Kenya from 5.9 to 5.5 now. And does this mean, I mean, how does the world look at Kenya when we have the World Bank actually slashing the prospects to 5.5 from 5.9?
I think how the world looks at us, I think if the world looks at the economic survey, and people do, and the confidential reports submitted for potential investors are not what you hear in the media here or on VOA or BBC. Corporations will not tell you they're not coming to Kenya because that's not their job. Private companies, if they shelve their investment plans, if they shelve their expansion, they don't announce it. It's sort of like Nestle announced that they were setting up a huge distribution center down at Athi River. There was, in fact, a ribbon cutting ceremony, a grand launch, I think in 2010. A couple of years later, we heard nothing about it, and when I queried some of the employees who they asked me, oh, you remember that? See, it's not for Nestle to say we have shelved our plans to have a huge distribution center in Athi River. They may want to come back someday, so why get everyone angry? Companies do not tell you when they're leaving or when they're scaling down, foreign companies, multinationals, because they may want to come back. Who needs to get everyone angry? If the World Bank says growth is going to decline this year, they say drought. They don't seem to want, nobody wants to talk about political risk here. That is a botched election, if there is an election on August 8th. 2017. I have a personal interest in the elections, having applied to be the IEBC chair or a commissioner, which is what this is fact. I think we are not paying attention to what's happening with investments. We are not paying attention to the short-term and medium-term effects of the political instability that we see. Because a lot of the political instability or the problems we are looking at were identified well in 2016. They actually were available to be seen in 2013. A lot of them have to do with the administration. Basic issuing of ID cards, keeping track of SIM cards, bank accounts, keeping track of money. In other words, if you can't stop money laundering, if you cannot basically keep track of people, if you can't essentially stop criminals from stealing money, from financial crime, ICT, then that's the real, that should be the real headline stories to look at. But the private sector will not tell you.
Wow. Thank you so much. That has been Andrew Franklin from the managing director of Frankline Management and Consultancy Limited, also worked at the U.S. Marine, giving us an analysis of the 2017 economic survey. Of course, a topic that we can never finish talking right now, but rather because of time, we have to end here. Until next time, thank you so much for keeping me company. Let's do this again next week, same time. I'm Victoria Amunga, and from me and my guest, it's good night and God bless.